Hello everyone, it's time for another Xenogears Combat Companion. This time I'll be covering two characters at once, those being Elly and Emeralda. Due to their similarities in combat and time in the party, I thought it would make the most sense to cover them both at once. I will talk about some slight Disc 2 spoilers, but I'll keep them light to avoid the reasons behind them. That said, let's get into it. Elly and Em are your quintessential Mage party members. On foot, their biggest difference is their agility. Elly has 8 while Em has 12. On top of this, Em has a bit better physical stats, though not to any significant amount. Their biggest defining features as combatants are their spell lists. Elly gets 3 sets of 4 spells, each being a different element. The first set are single target, the next are AoE, and the final hit all enemies. Emeralda only gets 2 sets, skipping over the AoEs. Of note, her spells do have a slightly higher power multiplier than Elly's, but it's so small that it really doesn't matter too much. One thing that isn't apparent by looking at these spells is the unique mechanic that Elly has. Each of her spells has a success chance, each of the 3 sets having 100, 30, and 20 respectively. This is added to her ether stat to get her total chance of success on a spell. Basically, if she uses a higher level ether spell and has too low an ether stat, you might get a message saying something like, "Sorry, I failed." This is just a simple damage reduction to 1/3 of what it normally would have done. It really isn't a very good mechanic, and with most builds you'll probably never even see it, but it is worth mentioning. Moving on to Em's unique mechanics, after completing the Lighthouse side quest at the end of Disc 2, she will gain the hidden 20% boost to her offense. It's just a very simple multiplier to her attack and ether stats, while in gear and on foot. Not much more to say, it's just a really good bonus. Speaking of gears though, let's move on to that. Crescens and Virage are a lot less distinct from one another, with 13 and 12 agility respectively. On top of that, they both have the same weight capacity of 600. They can both, of course, use the spells they could on foot, and Elly specifically can also equip weapons to offset her lower power multiplier of 7 compared to Crescens' 10. The biggest distinction between these two gears is Elly's access to one special option, while Crescens doesn't get any. Of course, the special option in question is the infamous air odds. They're unlocked after the Haishao fight and cost 400 fuel. It's a powerful non-elemental ether attack that damages all enemies and has a very high power multiplier. This, of course, is very overpowered and makes Virage many times stronger than Crescens despite the gaps in their stats. So, if Elly and Emeralda are so similar, which one should you use? Well, let's talk about their availability. Em doesn't join the party until the very end of the Solaris arc, right at the end of Disc 1. After that, she's part of your party forever. In contrast, Elly officially joins you after the Kislev arc and sticks with you right until the end of Anima Dungeon 2, where she is no longer usable. Who you should use simply comes down to how far you are in the game. Use Elly up until the end of Anima Dungeon 1, and then once you get to Anima Dungeon 2, give all her gear to Emeralda and keep going. Now I specifically say to swap over her gear at the start of Anima 2, as you won't get a chance to do so after she leaves the party, unfortunately. As ahead of its time as Xenogears was in some aspects of gameplay, it does fall flat here. Anyway, let's talk about the gear that you'll be using on the both of them. If you watched the last episode about Billy, you might have some idea of what we're going to be using already. Being ether-based characters, you should start out their ground gear with an ether doubler. Unlike with Billy, this will actually have a downside in Elly and Em since their EP costs will shoot up a lot, and their basic attacks aren't as strong as good fallbacks. For that reason, you might also want to equip them with the economy ether to reduce EP costs, though depending on the encounter you might want to forsake it for armor. With lower defenses, you'll probably want to devote their body and head slots to actual armor rather than accessories. If you're going into combat with lots of enemies, like in the Fort Jasper arc, combats can be very swingy if enemies decide to gang up on Elly and you haven't equipped her with enough armor. Of course, this can be compensated for if you're using a party member like Bart who has a taunt. We'll get to him in a later episode. Moving on to gear equipment, we first have to continue discussing ground equipment. Since ether is one of the only stats that carries over to your gear, you can further optimize your characters and effectively gain 3 extra accessory slots while in gear. Since you don't have to worry about your on-foot defense and gear sections, you're free to stack even more equipment for ether. Early game, the ether stone is nice, but once you get to Disc 2, you'll be able to upgrade to the large ether stone. Emeralda specifically also gets a special accessory which boosts her ether and ether defense by 10, though if you miss the mermaid tier at the very beginning of the game in Lahan, you won't be able to pick it up. That honestly isn't a massive deal, it's just a couple points difference, don't worry about it too much if you missed it. Moving on from ground gear to actual gear parts, with a low capacity of 600 you'll want to stick with 1 power magic and 2 E-circuits. If you want to go with the full 3 power magics, you'll end up losing 2 speed on both of them. With their agility as high as it is, it might be worth it depending on who you're fighting, though generally, and especially considering how low enemy ether defense is, you're probably better off with more speed since you'll be hitting the damage cap most of the time anyway. Now I want to add this section here to dispel a little bit of common advice I see on the internet. When regarding ether builds, a lot of players will instantly recommend new players pick up the ether doubler. While the ether doubler is an incredible accessory, I don't think it's the best thing to recommend to new players. It requires either really good money management or grinding to get, which isn't a good thing for new players. I think it's very important to note that the Ether Doubler has the same effect as 3 E-circuits in gear. With how the math surrounding Ether works, it's going to be much more cost effective to get E-circuits in gear for the early game. Anyway, tangent over, use E-circuits. In gear, Elly is safe to spam air odds, but since M doesn't have access to it, she'll need to use her spells. While they're not quite as powerful, they're still more than enough to give her good damage, and coupled with her high speed, she'll easily be able to keep up with the rest of the party. Now that's the basic gist of how to use these two, but I did want to go into a little bit more depth about their spells. Each set of spells contains one of each of the 4 elements. This means that in combination with certain party members, you can boost the damage of your characters even further. The main way to boost the damage of Ether is actually through the shield spells found on Citan and Billy. These grant resistance to one element and weakness to its opposite. What that means in practice is a minus 30% damage reduction for the resisted element and plus 30% for the opposite. With access to all elements, Elly and M will be able to take full advantage of this without having to worry about equipment like someone such as Billy might. It's also nice for the enemies who do actually have an innate elemental weakness, such as the boss of Anima Dungeon 2. All in all, Elly and M are actually quite straightforward characters, even if they do have some slight complexities. As long as you follow the ether stacking strat, you'll be totally fine. Just don't forget to pick up a bunch of E-circuits when you get to Tammuz. I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you so much for watching.